got so quiet so quickly. All I had to do was stand up. Anyway, thank you for coming tonight. Welcome. My name is Chris Benner. I'm the faculty director of the Institute for Social Transformation, one of the sponsors of this series of 6 events on the 2024 elections. And it's really a chance for some deep conversations, not just about the elections themselves, but where we are in our democracy and the broader politics of our society, how it's changing, and what do we do about the deep polarization that's going on. In addition to those of you who are here in person, and this is the first of our 6 events that we're having in person, as well as could be as much as 500 people online, so welcome. And thank you for joining us. The co-sponsors of the series include the Institute for Social Transformation, Merrill College, the Humanities Institute, the Science and Justice Research Center, the Politics Department Democratic Discourse and Engagement Initiative, Kresge College, John R. Lewis College, and College 9. It really does take a village to talk about what's going on in our democracy, and we're deeply appreciative of all of those co-sponsors. And a special thanks tonight to our Politics and Legal Studies Department, the hosts and organizers for tonight's event. Before we get underway, I want to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yupi tribe. The Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. It's really important, too, that these kind of land acknowledgements don't become simply performative exercises. So if you don't know about the work of the Amamutsan tribal band, please go to their website. They have a lot of information there. They also have a land trust, and you can look at that information online. It's being posted in the chat. It's amamutsan.org. A couple of details, logistical details for tonight. The event is being recorded, so tell your friends how great this conversation is when it gets finished, and it'll be up on the Institute website. And we're looking forward to answering your questions in the second half. So make sure you're thinking about what questions you have. For those of you who are online, we're using a webinar tool. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You just click that Q&A button. You can put your questions in there, and we'll answer that. For those of you in person, we have index cards that if you didn't get when you came in, we can hand them around, raise your hands, and we'll put it there. If you want to ask your own question with your own voice, put your name at the top of the card. Otherwise, we have 3 students, undergrads and graduates, who are helping us with the questions. We have 2 undergrads, Paulina Garcia and Reva Samant. Paulina is a politics and feminist studies major. Reva is a psychology and legal studies major. They'll be gathering questions in person. We have a brand new PhD student here who's going to be taking the questions online, Luke Heslip. And those of you online, I really want to encourage you to test Luke to see if he's really worthy of coming to UC Santa Cruz. So make sure you put in really hard questions. And please, all 500 of you, put a question in, okay? Okay, that's the logistics, right? We have an all-star lineup tonight to really talk about where we are in our U.S. democracy. And I'm just going to jump in, and their bios are online, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that, but please look them up. They're all professors in our politics department here at UC Santa Cruz. Anjali Verma, Liz Beaumont, Kira Tate, Dan Worrells, and Larry Gersten. Although I do have to say, we will very, very proudly claim Larry Gersten, although he did teach for 50 years at San Jose State University. So, but you're ours now, Larry. So, And we're going to do a bit of a lightning round initially, where they're just going to put in some key comments and things that they're thinking about related to their own work in the context of the US elections. Then we'll jump into a moderated conversation and then get to your questions. So Larry, I'll start with you.
Okay, let's go. First of all, it's great to see young faces. I'm so happy. You guys are so involved. I don't know how much you know this, but people between the ages of 18 and 29 represent 20% of the electorate this year. Huge number, a huge number. Latest polls, I've been doing some research, that's what I do, show men favoring Harris 3-2, showing women favoring Harris 3-1. So Harris leads right now. It's not unusual, but whether there's a turnout is what counts. Turnout was pretty good in 2020. If you're looking for the Democrats to win, the better the turnout of this group, the more likely. If you're looking the other way, stay at home. So that's my plug to you with gratitude. I got like 3 or 4 minutes to tell you about this election, the big picture. Good luck. Look, this in my mind is looking like it's what we call a realigning election. Election realignments happen 50 or 60 years, every 50 or 60 years. Very rare, very unusual. I think most people in my business look at the 1960s as probably the last time that happened with the civil rights legislation and all the Republicans becoming Democrats and Democrats becoming Republicans, especially the South. This is looking this way to me this time. We don't always know these things right away. It takes sometimes 2 or 3 elections before everybody comes together and says, yeah, you were right, or whoever was claiming it. Why do I say this? Here are some of the things that are happening this time that we have not seen that much in the past. All at once, mind you, all at once. We see some groups aligning with the Republicans that we did not expect in the past. The working class, okay? Those folks, you know, toward the bottom, not at the bottom, but toward the bottom, sometimes they're called blue-collar workers, who for so long were in lockstep with the Democratic Party. Not so much. We're seeing them move toward Republicans, not a majority, but we're seeing numbers move toward the Republicans that we haven't seen in the past. White males particularly, white high school graduate males particularly, are the biggest group of this group, okay? The biggest subgroup, moving. And Democrats are having a hard time finding reasons for them to stay. So those are the kinds of things that are going on with the Republicans that we have not seen that much of in the past. We also see stuff going on the other way, aligning with the Democrats. College-educated people who for the longest time found themselves aligned with Republicans, bit by bit find themselves more likely to be Democrats. And that's good if you're the Democrats, not so good if you're Republicans, but you've got the other things to worry about. Women, this time around, you've heard perhaps of the gender gap, which in the past has been maybe 10, 12%. Not this time. All the polls show perhaps a 15 or 16 point advantage for women for Harris, maybe a 12 or 14 point advantage for Trump. Women tend to vote more than men, so that happens to be, I think, a bit of a plus for the Democrats, perhaps. Of course, all of this happens under the freedom of our bodies thing, reproductive freedom. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. That could be a very big issue, depending upon how many women decide to come out. So those guys are going toward the Democrats. Some drifters in this whole thing. Drifters away from the Democrats, Latinos, not as solidly Democratic as they were in the past. They look to be still a majority this time, not as much. You need the margins on either side. You need the margins, not just a group, but as much as you can. Black men going the other way. We're seeing them attracted more to Trump. Does he get a majority? No. But perhaps he gets 35%, which is unheard of. Union members used to be lockstep with the Democrats. Not so much anymore. They're pretty unhappy with this globalization theme that many of you know about. Many of them are going the other way. That's why, for example, the Teamsters did not endorse Harris this time. That's a big bell that's ringing there for Republicans. And then we've got what I call the uncertainty. And the uncertainty happens both toward women and toward people of color. We'd like to think, many of us, that this whole thing about race is gone, this whole thing about gender is gone. Sorry, it's not. A recent poll shows that 93% of those polled say, it wouldn't matter to me if a man or woman runs. Well, that's 7% that you lose. That's 7% in a tight race. And then when asked about race, well, I couldn't find a recent poll on that, but the last one I found showed that 65% wouldn't mind accepting a person of color. Well, thanks. 65%, that means 35% are going the other way. Look, in a tight election, every one of these numbers means something. Every single one. So when you're voting, if you think your vote doesn't matter, let me tell you, this year around, matters more than ever. Next.
Dan, over to you.
Thank you. All right. So once again, we have a nail-biter of an election, and we're transfixed by this nail-biter and the fact that the outcome depends on a few votes in a few key states, and maybe even more so by the distinct possibility that we won't know the outcome right afterwards or for some time, and the real risk of not only political chaos, but also legal action and possibly violence. So it should not be this way, and it does not have to be this way. And let me quickly go over 3 reasons, one of which Larry covered. One sort of deeper reason, one sort of mid-range reason that Larry covered, and then the sort of big constitutional reason, which I'll get to. So the first reason is that what I think is the paramount fact of this whole election is that President Trump, former President Trump, should have been convicted by the Senate in his impeachment trial for his actions both before and during January 6th to overturn the results of the election. Instead, by a 57-43 vote, the conviction fell 10 votes short, not on principle, but on politics, as most of you know. This would have disqualified Trump from holding future office, all right? So that's the biggie, the most immediate thing. We never should have been facing this in any way, shape, or form because the Senate should have done its job. Okay. Second, younger voters. Again, to reinforce this point for most of the people in the audience, if you were turning out historically, much as people 60 or 50 and 60 and over did, basically the outcome of this election would not be in doubt, especially if that turnout happened in key states. We would be thinking about the outcome. And then the thing I wanted to emphasize is the Electoral College. That's the big constitutional thing. Couple points about this. To be more specific, our failure to get rid of the Electoral College and replace it with a direct popular election. If we had that today, once again, the outcome really wouldn't be in doubt. Think of Gore in 2000, Hillary Clinton in 2016, but even, of course, Joe Biden in 2020, where the election was so contested, not because, guy won 7 million more votes than Trump, but because of the distribution of those votes among a few key states. All right, so let me use the Electoral College really quick to make an analytic point about our current predicament. Once upon a time, constitutional reform was more bipartisan, mixed up. You'd pick a feature to reform and you wouldn't necessarily have a clear sort of distinction between Republicans and Democrats. The Electoral College is a good example. Going back a few decades at least, the broad majority of the public favored getting rid of the Electoral College and going to a direct popular election, and it was essentially bipartisan. The votes in Congress on this were essentially bipartisan. It is also, by some measures, the most proposed amendment to the Constitution, or at least consistently proposed across American history. The balanced budget is the most common one in recent history, the most feckless, useless one, but the most proposed. Right? So the Electoral College, to go back to 1970, the last major attempt to pass it, it looked like it would or could easily happen. In the House, they passed it by overwhelming majorities beyond the 2/3 necessary. It goes in the Senate, and you can probably finish the story. There's a filibuster in the Senate led by, you can finish the story, Southern Democrats who prevent it from coming to a vote in the Senate, and that's it, full stop. So a handful of racists prevent what the majority of the people, the House of Representatives, and even the president at the time essentially favored, right? So there we end up where we are now. So where are we now? Fast forward, white supremacy has been replaced by partisan polarization as the barrier. That is due to polarization, which I can explain more in the question and answer, and in particular, Republican protection and exploitation of minority empowering institutions such as the Senate, but also the Electoral College. The Republican elite, and now it's expressed itself in mass opinion, will protect the Electoral College as a benefit to their party because it allows a minority of the population by a few thousand votes in a handful of states to elect the president. And this now shows up in public opinion polls where there's indeed a division where more Republicans are for protecting the Electoral College and more Democrats are for getting rid of it. So as I said, this election should not be as it is for more than one reason, but our failure to reform our institution has only compounded the problems that plague us in policy and politics. Thank you.
We're going to let you present a little more optimistic picture in the Q&A because I think that was really discouraging. But thank you for pointing to the structural challenges we have. It's really important. Kira, I'll turn it to you to talk a bit about the legal issues in the Supreme Court.
And so, given the polarizing conditions that kind of Dan Worrells kind of speaks about, there's a question about where does the legal institution, the Supreme Court, fit into all of this, right? And the public outcry against the Supreme Court, as well as the unfavorable view of the Supreme Court, is very much reflective of the impact of polarization on the Supreme Court. Right? Over time, we have now seen that the court has established itself as an important political body. And there's many who argue that a lot of the decisions that the court is making, it's really less about law and precedent, and you can borderline say it's quite partisan, right? If you think about the recent case that grants, presidents absolute immunity for official acts, it was a 6-3 decision where 3 of those members were people that Trump nominated himself. Right? And the other 3 were closely aligned, either politically or ideologically, with Trump. Right? And so these signals kind of suggest that we no longer have a court that is independent and impartial. And there's a question of how do we control that? Right? And that is why we often have these proposals, right? We are hearing more about Biden's proposal to, add term limits in an attempt to constrain the court, right? And this proposal to strengthen the Judicial Code of Ethics that was passed last year, and maybe give it to Congress to establish in an attempt to constrain the court, to maybe even shield it from the polarization. And whether it amounts to anything is up for debate, but as long as the polarizing conditions that Professor Worrells kind of lays out, we're going to keep seeing our decisions that come out of the Supreme Court reflect that exact divide. And it's not the first time in our history that we have seen it. I think the question now, or the concern now, is that the implications of those decisions are way more dire, right? Trump versus US kind of says that, right? If you set up a court to mirror what the president wants, you're going to get outcomes that the president wants. And that's not the foundation of our government. And I'll let Liz take over the social issues related to law and courts.
Okay, thank you. I'm delighted to be here with my esteemed colleagues. Of course, it was very hard to think of just a few things to say in 5 minutes about such an important election. I have kind of one very big picture issue, and then I'm going to try to make time for two others. So the big stake kind of question for me is about the health of constitutional democracy. And then I see sort of on the opportunity side, coming back to Larry's opening, the question of the role of the youth vote as being very essential. And then if I have time, I want to very briefly talk about one key issue, which is the reproductive rights issue. So the stakes. Well, we can start by saying, what are the stakes for the American public? What do they think the stakes are? And I guess the good news is that there's widespread agreement that the stakes are high for constitutional democracy. The majority of Americans, regardless of party affiliation, agree about this. Fantastic. What's the problem? Well, polarization means not only is there disagreement about what those sources are, but that the disagreement is sort of operating in this kind of polar dynamic where they're butting up against each other. And this is especially happening around the issue of the very foundations of constitutional democracy, voting and elections themselves. So if you look at the opinions of people who tend to lean toward the political right or toward the Republican Party, the reason why they think constitutional democracy is at risk in relation to elections is that they think that our electoral integrity is at risk. So there's a real belief in problems of election fraud, that there are people who are not valid voters who are voting, that there are people taking advantage of mail-in balloting, that our voter ID laws are too lax, and that we have corrupt officials. Now, these fears are very strongly felt. I think we have to acknowledge that. They've grown since 2020 when Trump lost the election and continued to falsely claim that he had won and that the election was rigged. And this has occurred despite the fact that we've had dozens of audits, reviews, court cases, investigations, many of which have been led by or have had the participation of Republicans, and yet none of them have turned up any shred of credible evidence that there's a widespread problem with our elections. So it's important to recognize that this is both a deeply held view of a threat to democracy and one that has no substantiation. So these unsubstantiated views are driving, though, a lot of political behavior. So they've energized Republican legislators to pass a whole slew of new voting restrictions in the name of election integrity. And going into this election, as Professor Wuerls noted, Trump and a considerable segment of the public have said that they don't trust electoral institutions and they don't believe it's possible for Harris to legitimately win. So this is a real concern. So we've got this set of views of the problems or the challenges of the health of constitutional democracy now in a dialectical or a dynamic relationship with the views of Americans who tend to lean to the political left or toward the Democratic Party. And for them, the concern around elections is restrictions and erosions of voting rights. So for them, they see this proliferation of these new laws restricting voting access that have disproportionate effects on a lot of subpopulations that have already been historically disadvantaged or not included in American democracy. So racial minorities, urban populations, poorer people, people with disabilities, young voters, students, and seen in this way, even if the new voting restrictions are facially neutral, made in the name of electoral integrity, they pose direct threats to voting rights, to an inclusive constitutional democracy, and to the possibility of fair and equal representation. So this group also has fears about electoral subversion, the fear of efforts to undermine or overturn legitimate election results, and of course these were fueled by the January 6th riots and the discourse and the actions of former President Trump. So how are we supposed to think about these conflicting perspectives? Well, we're in an educational institution where our goal is to be developing knowledge, to be critically reviewing knowledge, to disseminating knowledge, and so we need to think about the research. And here there's actually a quite large body of research that is on conditions of constitutional democracy, not just in the US, but around the world. And if we look at this, coming from scholars, coming from think tanks, not just American scholars, scholars from around the world, we find that there are reports from Freedom House, IDEA, The Economist, Varieties of Democracy Project, or maybe you've read some of these books that have titles like How Democracies Die, or How to Lose a Constitutional Democracy. And these studies help us consider the health of American democracy in this broader context, both a broader context of historical developments, a broader context of cross-national developments, and they all sort of come to a surprising amount of consensus that one of the things that is occurring in the US and is occurring in established democracies elsewhere is that we have this problem of increasing political polarization, we have increasing economic inequality, we have an undermining of the flow of quality or evidence-backed information in the public sphere, we have the undermining of our electoral processes, and we have the rise of populist leaders who have authoritarian tendencies and who attempt attempt to consolidate their own power and place themselves above the rule of law. So this is not a pattern that is distinct to the US. It's one that we're seeing in many places. And I think it helps us to kind of contextualize the health of our constitutional democracy if we think about these broader patterns that go beyond the United States. And so this sort of suggests that when we think of the stakes of this election and how we participate in it, it's not enough just to think about being informed about the particular policies or the platforms of a given candidate or another and how much they align with our own views, but of this real question about where candidates stand with respect to the institutions of constitutional democracy. Do they respect all of the voters? Do they respect the electorate? Do they respect the institutions that make electoral democracy possible, regardless of whether the outcome is in their favor? And I think I'm out of time, so I'll just say there are two things I hope that will come up in the Q&A. On opportunities for influence, there's a huge opportunity for influence for Gen Z, all of you, for college student voters, which is one reason why a lot of this proliferation of voting restrictions is a problem, because it really affects college student vote, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well. There's also an opportunity for those for whom reproductive rights and abortion access is important. This is a very large number, and we've seen in prior elections and potentially in this one that the turnout for that issue and concerns about that issue could also be large enough to sway this very close vote. So we're at the point where the margins are so small, both at the level of the presidential election and a lot of the congressional and the local elections, that getting turnout from these particular groups or groups that care about particular issues would be enough to swing them. So I look forward to talking more about all of these things and all of your ideas.
And we will definitely come back to those issues, and I really appreciate you beginning to move to some of the more opportunities and steps forward. And we want to shift gears a little bit now to talk a little bit about California and what's on the propositions and the state of our democracy in California. So Angela, do you want to launch us on that one?
Yeah, so just briefly, what I hope to contribute tonight is to kind of situate what it means to be a Californian who is either making a decision about whether to participate in the election in the ways in which you're eligible to do so, and then if so, how to make decisions on this incredibly complicated, long, notoriously complex ballot that we have. And perhaps, the best quote that I've heard this election season about being a Californian and voting in the 2024 election is simply, much is asked of the California voter. So much is asked of the California voter, but the two levels that I really have in mind is sort of one from the inside, right? Sort of demystifying the ballot, what's on the ballot, but then also sort of in the inverse, sort of from the outside in, the role that California is playing in American politics and sort of in the future of this country and the preservation of democracy, and the ways in which California personalities, California sort of politicians and people who have been sort of forging their philosophies, their practice, their sort of art of politics in the Golden State are now, rising, right, to indeed the very top of the ticket with Kamala Harris. A moment that I think was a crystallization of sort of just an observation of one way in which California chose to perform itself to a national audience was at the Democratic National Convention in August. If you happen to watch the convention, there was the televised roll call vote. There was a DJ, which is perhaps when no one's brought up the DJ yet. Anyway, so California was either the last or one of the very last states to deliver its delegates in favor of Kamala Harris. And any representative of the government can deliver, these roll call votes. But, our governor, Gavin Newsom, is not just a sort of familiar and forceful face and voice for us inside the state. He has played a very interesting role and character in the development of the national politics of the presidential campaign, even before Kamala Harris, who is from California, was on the ticket. He was very much a surrogate for Joe Biden. He was a fierce opponent of Ron DeSantis, even though he wasn't running for president, or Gavin Newsom wasn't running for president during the primaries. And he is now, a very strong surrogate for Kamala Harris. Our governor is also constantly being asked if he is planning to run for president. Some people still online think that there's an 11th hour plan that Gavin Newsom will somehow end up, in the White House even this cycle. So, the sort of specter, I think, from the outside, from states that look at California and have a sort of self-definition of what they want to see the future of American politics be, is forged in the mirror of us. Either California is in fact what Gavin Newsom said in that roll call vote, California is where the future happens first. Don't try to deconstruct the temporality or logic of that statement, but if California is where the future happens first, outside of California, that's read as either a good thing or a very bad thing. And so at least one dimension of the politics around Kamala Harris's vote for president is whether the nation wants to become California, right? And so an implicit sort of, or let's say a proxy politics around her presidency is being had around California, either is this declining state or California is this shining state. And just I wanted to read one just brief quote from a book by Carrie McWilliams called California, the Great Exception. This is a classic book written in 1949 at the centennial or 100-year anniversary of California becoming a state. And I think that Carrie McWilliams' articulation of sort of the political cultural role that California plays for itself, but also for the nation is relevant today, even after so much time. So he says, quote, California, the giant adolescent, has been outgrowing its governmental clothes now for 100 years. Again, this was written in 1949. The first state constitution was itself an improvisation. And from that time to the present, governmental services have lagged far behind population growth. Other states go through these phases too, but California has never emerged from it. And it is this fact which underlies the notorious lack of social and political equilibrium in California. The state is always off balance. It is always stretching itself precariously, improvising, seeking to run the rapids of periodic tidal waves of migration. And right now, it is trying to negotiate the latest and most dangerous of these recurrent rapids. The tensions created by the constant lag between government services and population growth is best appraised in light of the fact that since 1940, California added all of this population, and he goes on to sort of say that California will never stop growing. That's part of its own character, its own definition. And I'll just end with the fact that California's population has stopped growing. We lost population for the first time in 2020. And so to end with sort of a state political anxiety, I think that we see in some of the propositions, which we'll talk about later, is an anxiety at once about the sort of perennial, can the government provide the supersized need, for the supersized needs of this supersized population with supersized problems. But also this fear that people are leaving California, that the California dream is over. Elon Musk moved his factory and other, big corporations. And so, the meta question that I think the politics is orbiting around on this ballot for us as Californians is the California dream dead? And is it worth it to live here? Is it still worth it? And so that's on my mind, and I hope to talk about the specifics as we get going. Thanks.
Well, and I'm never going to think about California politics again without thinking about rafting a river in the rapids. And I'll just mention, I happened to be at an event yesterday with Gavin Newsom, and he was telling everyone in that audience that we have to update our talking points. Because apparently in the last year, the population drain has reversed again. So we may be back in the bright, sunny California.
Did he say that California is the future happens first here?
No, I think...
Because that's one of his talking points.
He didn't mention that time. He also mentioned, by the way, that California now has more headquarters of Fortune 500 firms than ever before in the history, which is a counter-argument to Elon Musk moving. Now, we know there's a lot of misinformation in politics. I haven't fact-checked that, but I'm just passing it on. But Larry, I wanted to come back to you because I know you've been following a bit of the ballot propositions in California and thinking a bit about the broader processes that have led to what's on our ballot this election. Just talk to a little bit about what's on your mind about the ballot propositions. And I'll just mention for those in the audience here, we can start collecting your questions now, and I'll ask you two to go do that. But Larry, over to you.
But not every state has statewide ballot propositions. That's the first thing. About 18, 20, I forgot how many, something like that. So it's not typical. The other thing we need to realize is that they started with a series of reforms about 115 years ago. A group called the Progressives, and they wanted to bring policy making to the citizens. They were not happy with the legislature any more than a lot of people right now are not happy. And so they came up with this system of where the people will be their own legislature. That's what Hiram Johnson said. He was the leader of this effort. The people will be the legislature. So since then, we've had about 1,200 of these ballot propositions qualify. 5% of the voters from the last gubernatorial election are needed. That's to sign up for a statute, 8% for a constitutional amendment. Our Constitution is about this thick. It's the third largest constitution in the world. I recommend if you read it during only daylight hours, it's as cumbersome as the initiatives on the ballot now. So that's a little background for you. I forgot how many, I think maybe 10 we've got this time. And they're frequently initiated by voters, but often with that are very powerful interest groups, and we've got bundles of them in this state who are quietly supporting these things one way or the other. The League of Conservation Voters, that's a good environmental group, powerful. The California Apartment Owners Association, California Chamber of Commerce, the California AFL-CIO. I could go on and fill the next 45 minutes with powerful interest groups that often lock head like horns in the legislature. They don't succeed, and so they come at us through propositions. And so you are left to decide these propositions, which I am convinced are written by somebody who has never known a word of English, because if you read them, and I think I know something about English, I cannot understand them for the life of them. So many of them, at least. They are incredibly, if it's not this, it's not this, it could be that, but maybe it's this. I mean, and you decide. They're terrible. And I will give you a hint as to how I make up my mind with some of these things, because quite frankly, I've been doing this all my life. I've written books on this crap, and I'm telling you, it's still confusing. If I'm in doubt, here's my hint. If I'm in doubt about a problem, I go to interest groups that I like. And how are they voting on this? Who's behind this proposition? And that gives me some light as to how I will vote. Because sometimes, I'm telling you, I can't understand them, and I think I should be able to. So that's a separate argument, separate discussion. But meanwhile, you've got some doozies this time, and we can talk about them more specifically
Well,
later.
let's do that now. And I know both Anjali and you were looking at propositions. Are there particular ones on the ballot we should be paying attention to? Where do they come from?
You want to start?
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. So just to another side of Larry's sort of revealing how he decides what to vote on. I mean, I kind of do the opposite, and this is really just to kind of, say that the job of the California voter, it's like not all of us are paid to study this stuff or write books about it, and when you are trying to decide how to vote, you use heuristics, right? And one heuristic, right, is to go and look at your partisan groups. Mine is to go look at the ones that I don't like and see whatever, you know, whatever they have said that they're in favor of, I vote the opposite. But so just a sort of lay of the land, we have 10 propositions on the ballot this time in 2024. The first 5 of them are actually placed there by law or by the legislature. And a subset of those are just required under our Constitution. Just the lawmaking structure that we have is that if the Constitution is being proposed to be amended, that can't take place in the legislature alone. It needs to happen direct to the people. So we have a number of constitutional amendments that are actually in that first 5 of the propositions. And then we also have statutory changes to actual, you know, codified law that the legislature has voted to put to us, the voters, either because they want to, and there's an interesting politics around that. Often that's a hot potato that legislatures want the voters to kind of endorse. No one wants to step out too far, but mainly it's whenever we want to galvanize a revenue source through taking out state bonds, which is a way of creating more debt for the state. And here again, this is a sort of artifact of the progressive sort of reaction to not trusting our lawmakers to make decisions about budgets. So you can think of the first 5 propositions on your California ballot as they're there at the initiative of the legislature, either because the Constitution requires that this is a decision that be put to you as a voter, or because the legislature has decided that it would like voters to vote on this rather than take its own power, right, to make this decision. And then the last 5 are there through what you might be more familiar with if you've ever gone to a Whole Foods and had people with a clipboard ask you for your signature. These are the citizen-initiated initiatives. And I really think of these as the kind of propositions to be very attuned to what is the motive, right, behind it. I mean, even before understanding what it does, it's like, okay, wait a second. Who was willing to put the time, the money, and the energy into getting this on the ballot, which is not easy, right? It requires a lot of signatures, it requires a lot of money, it requires organized political mobilization. And so I always want to know who cares enough to do this. And so those are the citizen initiatives, and you have sort of everything from sort of raising the minimum wage to a genre of initiatives that can be quite confounding for both understanding what they're trying to do, but also trying to figure out what your politics are, which are initiatives that repeal previous initiatives. And so the final initiative is perhaps the one that I've been most attuned to because it's in my area of research around criminal justice reform. And for now, I'll just leave it there, that it's a case of an initiative that revises a previous initiative, which was an initiative that revised a previous initiative. And so it's super fascinating because I've started to think of this kind of proposition as like a genealogical, like an inheritor. You know, it's like an inheritance of a direct democracy process in sort of a different era. And certainly with criminal legal politics in California, we've had so many distinct eras, like a pendulum swinging back and forth. And so some of these propositions are like heirs, right, to that. So.
And I guess one of the key takeaways is to do your homework on the propositions.
We can say more about how to do that later.
Yeah. Larry, is there any particular one you wanted to say anything before we move beyond propositions?
I will, but I got to tell you this story. I can't resist. You know, ballot propositions are often used at the local level too. Land use is one awfully done. Dealing with homeless people, a variety of them. Many, many years ago when I was teaching at San Jose State, and I should say, in most cases, not all, but in most cases, people are not collecting signatures because they love being in the sun. They're collecting signatures because they're paid. And that's because a big group behind the proposition needs to get the signatures, and so they pay people per signature. So you go do a pretty good job in a weekend at a mall if you're looking for some work. So I'm walking to class one day, and this, I thought he was a student, young person, comes up to me and says, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind signing this petition to get this issue on the ballot?" What was the issue about? Well, the issue is about making sure that this land out there in South San Jose stays undeveloped, okay, undeveloped. I've never signed a petition in my life, never. First of all, I don't believe in them, okay? That's the first thing. So now you know how I am on that. So I said, no, thanks. That doesn't appeal to me. And as I'm walking, he said, "Doesn't appeal to you, huh?" I said, "No. How about signing this one that says we'll go ahead and keep things so that we can develop it, okay? No development on this one, sir. You can develop on that one, sir. Take your pick."
Yeah, that's a great.
That's what I mean. Okay, that's what I mean. I mean, these things are everywhere, and you got to understand what they're about. Propositions are like my children. I love all of them. I mean, I love all of them not because I believe in them, but because they're a story, as Angelique said, about California and what we're all about. And yes, I do believe with generations, we often go back to where we were before, which was something else before that. It's just part of the craziness of California. I like the marriage equality one, Proposition 3, I think it is. You say, what? Marriage equality? What the hell? Well, believe it or not, in 2008, I think it was 2008, we passed Proposition 8, which said, we do not believe in marriage. The only marriage between anyone and everyone, a man and a woman, if you can imagine that. Okay, now it turns out, we didn't know this at the time, but the Mormon Church was very, very active in promoting this. And a lot of people just didn't think about it one way or the other. And it just sort of passed, quietly. And then everybody looked around. Well, then, of course, the Supreme Court said, no, marriage can be between any two adults, okay? So basically declaring that initiative in any state's law like that unconstitutional as far as they're concerned. So, okay, leave it alone. So why is this thing on the ballot now? Well, if you've watched the Supreme Court over the last few years, they've gone way to the right on a number of issues, okay? Women's reproductive freedom are a good place to start. A justice on the Supreme Court has already indicated his opinion that gay marriage should be outlawed as unconstitutional, and we can go from there, okay? Where does it stop? Well, that's why this one was put on the ballot by the legislature, thinking if the Supreme Court is really going to leave things to the states, as they're saying with reproductive freedom, we better have a guarantee in our state constitution that protects gay marriage. Okay, all that, jogging around, to make sure something's okay because of what's happened at the Supreme Court. So that's why I like that one, and I suspect it's going to pass without any difficulty. And I'll give you a couple more real quick. Proposition 33 is rent control. Okay, twice in the last couple of elections, not the last two, but the last 3 or 4 elections, 2 times it's been on the ballot. And what it does is allows local governments to have a much heavier hand in rent control. Now, they have a little opportunity in some rare cases, but what this would do is allow much more rent control given to the powers of local governments, cities and counties. I like this because it's so patently clear as to who's against it. And that's the California Apartment Owners Association, right? I mean, at least you know who's against this thing. That helps me vote on this, okay? And the Chamber of Commerce, another good group, okay? And what are they doing? They're protecting their own interests, which makes sense. We all protect our own interests. I get that. And then the other one is the one Angelique talked about, Proposition 36, because, again, it basically reverses much of what was done in Proposition 47, which reversed what was done something else a while ago. And this is all about dealing with crime and how we manage it. And even at the state and local levels, this issue has become very, very important to a lot of people. It's affecting the mayor's race in San Francisco. It's affecting a recall in Alameda County. It's affecting the mayor's race, which is also under recall in Oakland. So that one I think is going to draw, and I suspect it's going to pass. I've seen the polls, depending upon the poll, between 60 and 70% are going to pass it. Some people think that's a knee-jerk reaction. Other people think it's moving the state more toward the center, but it's going to be a biggie. So those are some of the ones that I.
Great, thank you for that.
favorites.
Let's shift gears a little bit now, and you mentioned reproductive rights, and I know you talked about that, Liz, and wanted to come to that, but Kira, I actually wanted to start with you to remind us the Dobbs decision and what you see as being at stake in this election around reproductive rights in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, so Dobbs essentially established that this is a decision that's left up to the states, right? And so this is no longer a question about the federal government kind of regulating reproductive rights. It's down to the individual voters in their individual states, right, with their state legislatures, kind of working these issues out. Since Dobbs, the public has gone out in certain states and have actually voted the other way, right? They're kind of like, wait a minute, okay, you've given it back to the states, and states are telling their states, we don't agree with you on the anti-abortion stance, right? And so that's something that's going to come up in this election, where there are, you know, other senators and governors who are re-elected in this question about what does the people want versus what the state wants, and that divide is going to show up over and over again.
Actually, I want to let Liz have a chance. Liz, do you want to talk about reproductive rights, and then we'll come back to you, Angela.
Yeah, well, and this actually adding to the kind of building on the ballot proposition, 10 states have a reproductive rights or an abortion rights issue on the ballot. Since Dobbs, when these things have come to voters themselves, they have, for the most part, been sort of endorsing or supporting reproductive rights. When they have been decided by state legislatures, when those have been Republican legislators, they have mostly been maintaining very restrictions or bans on abortion. And so, you know, one of the things that's going to happen in this election is, this kind of issue of a lot of people, some people in 10 states will get to vote directly on what they want to be happening in their states. People in other states where it's not on a sort of a ballot initiative, though, if they're in a state where their state legislators have been supporting or passing restrictions, the turnout sort of in opposition against them or in favor of candidates who take the other position could really affect those, kind of those races, as well as what it might do for the presidential vote. And so the numbers of people who support reproductive rights is very large in the US. So before Dobbs, it was an overwhelming majority who said that they supported abortion in most cases. After Dobbs, that continued to be the case. A majority of Americans say that they oppose Dobbs. So it's not surprising that then when we see this come to the voters themselves in ballot initiatives and so on, that this is the way that they're voting. And it's not surprising that this energy and what many call backlash against the Supreme Court's decision is winding up, affecting a lot of our ballot initiatives, a lot of our electoral politics, and potentially could affect the presidential race. So one sort of abortion rights activist has been referring to this as Roe-vember, meaning that if those who want to kind of shore up the Roe versus Wade decision and voice their opposition to Dobbs turn out, they could sway the whole election cycle from kind of the presidential to the congressional and on down in favor of that issue.
Great. Angela, did you want to add something?
I was just going to add as a point of history that in the 2022 general election in California, Californians voted yes on a Proposition 1, I believe it was, to put a right to reproductive privacy in the California state constitution. So, and if I recall correctly, California was the first state to kind of write up this reproductive privacy sort of way of importing a right at the state level into their constitution. And so California is where the future happens first, folks.
You heard it here.
And a lot of states that you see who have that mechanism are really are like writing off of a template from California. So future happens first here.
I want to come. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Larry, and then I'll come back to you, Dan. I have a question for you.
Democrats are really counting on Dobbs to make the difference, because it did in 2022, it did in 2023, 7 states, every one of them, conservative states, or crazy states, Ohio, okay, places like that went ahead and voted for Dobbs. But they didn't have a presidential election. They did not have a presidential election. And although I believe Dobbs is really important for a lot of people, I'm not sure that it's going to be enough to carry this election. I think there are headwaters, is that what I want to say? You know, counter, right.
Rapids, I think was
Okay, rapids, whatever, that counter this, and I will say it right now, I know there are a lot of you between me and the door, but if the election were held today, Trump would win. And I'll be happy to elaborate on that if you let me live.
Well, and part of that, of course, comes back to the issue that Dan was talking about of the Electoral College. And Dan, I wanted to ask you, one, maybe to explain the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is one thing that people have pointed to as a way of getting around Congress to get rid of the Electoral College, and whether you think that has any chance of moving forward. It's another place where California has been sort of at the forefront of. But then also to give you a chance to say anything more about the politics of this moment that you haven't had a chance to add yet.
Okay, so many of you know there is this thing out there. It doesn't get a lot of press. This National Popular Vote Compact, which is based on some clever individual looked at the Constitution and realized that the openness of the provision that gives the power to state legislatures to determine how the electoral votes are awarded. So that tomorrow California could decide to do it by a flip of a coin. That would be constitutional. They wouldn't get away with it, but it would be constitutional. So someone realized, well, what if states joined a compact, and the compact was, we will award our electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, having nothing to do with the vote in our state. But the compact only takes effect when enough states have joined the compact to form a majority of the Electoral College, right? 270 plus. I forgot to look up before tonight, we were like, I don't know, 70-some% there or something like that.
Yeah,
15.
about 220 electoral votes, I think, somewhere in there.
Yeah, we got a bunch, and there's some big states like California and other states, Minnesota, I think, or whatever, and District of Columbia. But the problem, once again, with polarization is that you run into this wall where the Democratic states have passed it, and the Republican states won't consider it, right? But the idea would be not that would be the permanent replacement, but for some miracle it actually was passed. It would be the final impetus to then produce a constitutional amendment to actually make it then in the Constitution instead of this kind of backdoor mechanism, even if it is constitutional. And just one quick point about what I said. What I want to make sure people understand, my point was not partisan about the Electoral College. If the Electoral College were completely 100% the other way, if the Senate favored the Democrats, I'd be for exactly the same reforms. I want to get rid of the Electoral College no matter which party wins. I want to get rid of equal representation in the Senate, as another example, no matter which party benefits from it, because I think democracy demands both those changes. So I just want to make that clear. Thank you.
Really looking at the structural issues. I appreciate that. We're going to turn to your questions really soon, but I want to ask the money question. There was a headline recently that Kamala Harris has raised almost $1 billion since she became the candidate. I've seen estimates that the presidential race might get up to $6 billion. And all federal elections, including the Senate and the House, the current estimate is almost $16 billion. So Kara, I actually want to start with you to maybe tell us a little bit about Citizens United and how we got to this place where there's such money. I realize it's not all Citizens United. A lot of it is our media, and we've been having some conversations about that. And then open it up to anyone else to talk a little bit about how you see the role of money in politics and what we can do about it. But Kira, first to you.
Yeah. How we got to this place, I think it's Citizens United, right? If anyone remembers that case, the decision literally says, I'm like loosely translating, but corporations are people. And thus, as people, they can contribute the same way we would. They didn't consider that one, corporations have way more money than the average voter, and thus the voice that is attached to that money is a lot louder coming from the corporations. And it's proven to be true, right? Kamala Harris texted me asking me for $40, right? I'm not sure my $40 matters compared to a larger corporation, right? And so that Citizens United is the problem, and I'm not convinced that we'll ever be able to get to a point to overturn it, right? I don't think the same set of conditions could arise again, and with this particular court and its current construction, we're going to see a lot of 6-3 for a long time. This 6-3 divide, and it, depending on who gets nominated again, and if somebody gets to retire or suddenly ill, we may get a 7-2. And should this question of money come up again, this particular court with this construction is just going to uphold Citizens United, right? As long as polarization is the practice of our politics at the moment.
Anyone else want to take on the money question? Liz?
I might just add another 2 cents onto Professor Tate's excellent points. So Citizens United, if you're not familiar with it, if you haven't had a chance to take Professor Tate's class or maybe others that are offered. So this was a 2010 decision. It overturned 100 years of legal precedent that had allowed restrictions on campaign finance spending. So even though things were very bad in the US has always had a problem of money in elections. So it's not to say that it was night and day, but the Supreme Court, in reaching its decision in that case, it overturns 100 years of precedents that had allowed restrictions on campaign spending, says that corporations are people too for purposes of free speech. In addition to that, what happens is that the allowance of unlimited independent spending by corporations gives rise then to not just PACs but super PACs, and so then it's this exponent. So it's always a problem, but then it's exponentially. This Supreme Court really just kind of opens the floodgates to this this problem becoming even more exacerbated. And there is I'd say a lively but not yet powerful enough move to amend to overcome Citizens United through a U.S. constitutional amendment, but for the same kind of some of the same reasons why it's so difficult to get an amendment regarding the Electoral College. It's also very difficult to get an amendment regarding Citizens United, and maybe it's even more difficult because both parties are benefiting from Citizens United. This is one where actually sort of the parties are not polarized. They both like the amounts of money that they're able to raise, and it's become this, as you can tell from maybe your phones and your texts and your emails, it is a total arms race. I mean, it's just, on both sides. There's no, it's a problem across the board in our politics, and it's really, really a challenge.
I think we'll turn to your questions now, and we'll start here in the room, and then we'll go online. So, Priscilla?
Mic on? Get a live mic.
So our first question is, in terms of the youth vote, how important do you think international politics, in parentheses, the various wars and genocides around the world, and the Democrats' policies on it will matter, especially with the way college protests were handled by the current Democratic government?
Who wants to take that one?
Oh, sorry.
Larry?
You need to, this is hard, but you've got to separate where we are in this wonderful bubble, and some of us never leave it, okay, to what it's like out there, okay? For people who are involved, engaged, as you are and others in college and universities, it matters. It matters. It matters a whole lot more than it does to the rest of Americans and even to the rest of young people. Scores very low, just below bottom.
I mean, these issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I say,
do you want to say something
just a little bit more? So I think, as far as these issues in the election, again, you're really talking about students or young people failing to turn out in sufficient numbers in basically 2 or 3 states, and that could matter. The non-committed movement, if it has any effect in, let's say, Wisconsin or something like that, actually could matter, really could. So.
Can I add just Briefly too, I mean, I think the bubble, the bubble point is well taken, and I'm grateful for the bubble in many ways. But in some ways, we're not in the bubble. I mean, like, you know, here at UC Santa Cruz, in our very campus, I think, you know, our students, our faculty have experienced like government repression, right, and the repression of protest. And I think the difficulty, right, sort of both in terms of looking up at sort of the candidates that we're electing is to, you know, it's so abstract to try to knit, like, well, how would the choice that I'm making, right, between Donald Trump as president or Kamala Harris as president change the way that my university, for instance, like, responds? You know, like, so I think that it's an attenuated, there's this irony, right, where I think that students are experiencing in very direct ways, like government repression, and that's part of the betrayal of it, right? Whether it's through dismissals or arrests or expulsions or getting fired from your labs or whatever. But I think that the candidates have not really done a good job, and perhaps it's a third rail of politics, like what is the position on the Gaza Israel war. Like, it's a third rail of politics in some ways, but even if we're hearing a debate about that international policy question, just as an example, it's hard to link that down, right, to the politics on campus. And so I think that's been a failure of the discourse of, like, the debates. And if it's true that there's been $16 billion that have been invested in creating campaigns of persuasion, I guess that just shows that money can't really buy good discourse. I mean, or maybe it's because of the money that the discourse has, like, carefully seemed to avoid anything, you know, with detail that would link local struggles to your national choices.
Great, Luke, we'll turn to someone online.
Yes, someone from our Zoom audience asks if white nationalism is a major source of political polarization in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, does the sun rise from the east? I mean, there's no question about it. It's proven. I mean, and if you look at the Trump campaign, you know, he is so dependent upon them. If you remember, what is it? Proud Boys, stand by and stand back, right? Or stand back and stand by, whatever it was. They're both good people on both sides. With the brown shirts attacking the reformers who are waiting for statutes to be taken off the University of Virginia. We can go on and on. The kind of statements that former President Trump makes about people of color, whether they're Haitians who live in huts, or whether they're, or you know, or eating dogs and cats, you know, things like that. And you go down the list. Okay, Muslims, you know, Latinos, you know, they're all the murderers. I mean, one after another. And the right, you know, the white nationalists, this is manna from heaven. So this is what they want, and this is how this. At his rallies, you always have members from those various groups there, making sure that people who might get out of line with a protest are swept out. It happens all the time. It happened for the first set of rallies. It happened the second set, and it's happening now.
Dan, you want to take that too?
This is a broader point, and this is speculative. You know, I keep thinking about, once upon a time, we worried about religion being brought into politics, like in the late 70s and 80s. And now I'm wondering whether the concern is that politics has been transformed into religion, meaning that politics has now become the functional equivalent of faith for millions of Americans. As the lines have become so blurred that, you know, many Americans now essentially are having faith experiences through their politics, essentially, right? And so this relates to white nationalism because that is in part and parcel of that. It's one of the components, I think, of that conversion.
Right. You can see, I'm sorry, Christian white nationalism.
Right, is a thing. Right. And so, you know, not to be too snarky about it, but you can kind of wonder whether some people who were in the pulpit almost regret trying to bring religion into politics because now it's gone so far that in effect they've been replaced by Fox News and talk radio to some extent. And I think that is a real problem in this country, the extent to which that's true.
Paulina, another question here? Oh, Reva.
Yeah, so Vincent had their own question. Would you like to go ahead and ask? I can bring the mic over.
Yeah, please wait for the microphone.
Do you think the president should still have the power to appoint Supreme Court justices? If not, who should that power fall to?
Kira, I think you get that one.
I think
It's a shared power.
right. Our current design, right, is designed to balance the power of the court, right? And I still think presidents should still be responsible for nominating, with the Senate confirming. I don't think that structure should change at all, because it, ideally, if it works well, right, if the balance is truly there, if the representation is truly there, right, we're supposed to get a Supreme Court that is designed that would represent some type of impartiality. What has happened, though, is the polarization that happens with the president and Congress, if they're on the same side or not, is the struggle for power for putting justices in particular seats, right? Over time, we have increasingly seen the nomination, the appointments of particular justice become these really fiery debating places. And that's kind of where we get this push for term limits comes from, right? It's that we're no longer trusting that the nominating president and the confirming Senate will actually put set of justices on there that will be impartial. In fact, if you line up the set of circumstances together, you can create a court of your own design, which kind of happens for Trump, right? He gets the perfect storm of events to line up a set of justices to work in his favor, and to also change policies for after he's gone, right? This court in its current construction will be here for another 40 years or so. The recent 5 are still young enough, and they're far away from retirement, right? And so I still think the way the process work should still stay, but there's some considerations.
Kira, you briefly mentioned the idea of term limits, and Biden's proposal was that justices would have a single 18-year term, and that would be the limit of it. And could you say just a little bit more? I actually heard that first from Dan, and I know as a proposal, I know you've talked about it at certain points, but can you talk a little bit whether you think that has any potential? And you've also talked a bit of another part of his proposal was the ethics, or a stronger code of ethics for Supreme Court judges.
Yeah, so it would be 18 years, and ideally how that's supposed to work, what ends up happening from these 18-year terms is every president would get at least 2 nominations. And so the goal is that if every president was almost guaranteed a nominations, you would kind of collapse some of the polarization, because we're no longer struggling. It's not like I'll sit for my 4-year term and never get a nominee. You're guaranteed 2. There's much to be admired about the plan, right? It's very attractive, and possibly we'll get to a place where we have a less polarized court if that is the case. But I think to say that is to then put the blame on the justices themselves and not realize that the process itself is what's polarizing, which then creates a polarized situation on the court. The justices don't get there and rally their party flag, right? Their nomination and their confirmation kind of determines where their allegiance lies. So if you collapse it at the top, you change it on the bench. And so those are my kind of thoughts about it. I'm attracted to the plan, but I don't think it will achieve what he thinks.
Great, thank you. Did you want to comment on that one?
I just wanted to maybe add a dimension to this, which is that on a different level, which is maybe more of a long-term point about sort of the character of where American law fits in our American experiment, and the ways in which legal education and law schools produce a certain kind of legal actor who has a certain sort of set of ideas about what they do when it comes to thinking about constitutional jurisprudence. And I think that, I'm adding a layer to what our problem is. The problem space here, I think, is it would be short-sighted of us to just look at sort of the executive power question as well as this political polarization question, because I think what is a necessary ingredient to what we're seeing today is to have had decades of sort of work done by a certain set of ideologies in law schools to produce a ready-made, like, working force of people from whom to pick out, nominees who would have already been sort of ingrained in a mentality about what law is for, what constitutional jurisprudence is. And some of that, you could argue, comes down to just differences of philosophical opinion, about sort of the limits of power and the rule of law. But I think that part of the public's, like, waning of trust in the court is I think the public can differentiate between two people who disagree about sort of a fundamental philosophical question about the rule of law, for instance. But I think what we're smelling is the fact of sort of using law as a weapon, right, in service of a certain ideology. And I just want to point out that, like, that whole idea and sort of skill and mentality of what it means to be a judge, or, which begins with being a lawyer, is being produced in our nation's best law schools. I mean, that was a movement that began, before I was born. And so we're seeing those people kind of bloom and get picked and put. So for those of you going to law school, I mean, beware, because
and do it differently, okay?
Yeah, because there is an indoctrination project going on in law schools. Yeah.
Luke, online.
Is it healthy at the state or federal level for the same party to control the executive and legislative branches, thus depriving the opposition party of considerable influence?
Well, it's sort of politics 101 in the debate between a presidential system and a parliamentary system, right? That's fundamentally what you're talking about. In any parliamentary system, many of which function quite well, the executive and the legislature are essentially one and the same. And therefore, yes, a united government is a natural part of the system. We tend to look at our system as having all these checks and balances, and part of the checks and balances is that, even though the Constitution doesn't demand this, that the institutions end up in the hands of different sort of partisan groups. We don't have to have that, we often do. I think one of the problems, of course, with having divided government is you don't know who's responsible for the outcomes. And that happens time and again, that the outcomes are sort of, in fact, sometimes with divided government, you get no outcomes. That is the outcome, right? And that becomes the problem. And so who do you blame? So I tend to believe in united government, and I believe there are reforms to make the United States look a little bit more parliamentary without going the whole way to a parliamentary system.
And we can point out that California is a trifecta state, where California, for most of, I guess, the 21st century, has been exactly an example of the executive, the legislature, all being a supermajority Democrat, and yet our government doesn't find ways to be stalled and find polarization, right, even within like a single party. So.
Great.
Yeah.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and so I think to get as many questions in, we're going to try and do the rapid fire version response, because I see a whole stack here. So Paulina, let's go for it.
Should I have the audience member read it, or should I just read it?
I think maybe you just read it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this question says, do you think that there will come a time when demographic changes will overcome the Electoral College minority advantage?
Will overcome.
Will overcome the Electoral College minority advantage.
Not demographic changes in themselves. Okay, I need 60 seconds, and after this you can hate me all you want. The main problem that we're sort of like going all around and not cutting to is that we have lost our knowledge of democracy. What democracy means, how democracy works. We stopped teaching it in the schools from this high to all the way to the top 40 years ago. It's just not important. Things like civics, civic engagement, how we play a part in our country, why it's important. The elections, win or lose, binary, that's fine, but that's not democracy. Democracy is when the loser accepts losing and says, I'll try to get you the next time. and has that opportunity. Democracy is when people find ways to reach consensus because they understand that's the best way to get things done. Democracy is ways where you allow the media to go ahead and express themselves and what they learn and not try to shut them down. All these things are threatened right now, that they've never been threatened before. And if you don't understand it, that's what this election's about more than anything else, more than any other theme. And that's what we have to get our arms around. And worse than that, it's not going to be solved this election. This is long term. And the sooner we stop, the sooner we have a chance to save what's taken us this long to get. I have 3 seconds left. I yield.
Luke, next question.
Should California adopt ranked choice voting and proportional representation?
And maybe whoever answers can, explain ranked choice.
Well, those are sort of two different things, right? Explain ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting, just allows you to order the candidates 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many they are, and then the system of eliminating the lowest ranking candidates until you get a majority winner. Basically, that's way too fast. That can, in theory, have an effect on polarization by forcing candidates to think about how they're going to get those second and third votes and so forth. Whether that carries out in practice, I think have yet to see. Only a couple states have adopted this, Alaska, Maine, and some localities. So it's not totally clear whether it works. Proportional representation is just basically totally different in the sense that it directly translates votes into, party seats, whether you're the majority or the minority or a third or fourth party. That would be my preference, would be proportional representation. I think ranked choice voting is a second best solution given that we are a district-based system.
Great. Riva?
So Rhea had a question, so I'm just going to pass it to her.
In terms of reproductive care, how will the potential election of Harris change the course of action, specifically if no Supreme Court justice steps down? What can the executive branch really do, especially if it doesn't have the support of Congress?
Is that without the support of Congress?
Without the support of Congress.
Whoa.
Yeah, I was going to say then I think you're deadlocked, right? And so then there's not much that Harris, on her own can do.
She can appoint an AG, right?
Well, you can certainly help keep the FDA from being attacked and destroyed, right? Mifepristone and these other kinds of drugs. That's one thing that can happen. And secondly, it's the opposite. At least you know where the other side's going, right? You know, and you know at least Harris is not going to go in that direction. But everybody knows, you can't do it by yourself. And that's one of the sad things about presidential campaigns. They say, I will pass this, I will pass that. You know better. Presidents don't pass anything, right? They may write a regulation or an executive order. They don't pass anything, but they all tell us that, and we all listen to it, which gets back to my earlier point. No, I mean, it's limited, but there are things she can do, not as much as people might want.
I want to give you an opportunity, though, to raise one other question or issue about Congress, because we have some really important House races in California that point to why everyone in California should get out to vote. Does one of you want to talk about those races?
There are
Larry,
10 that are considered marginal, okay, either way, 10. And New York has got another half a dozen. And between those two states, you're likely to see the composition of Congress one way or the other, yeah.
So, as some of you have probably read, odds are that we have a real possibility where the Senate flips from being barely Democratic to Republican because of the nature of which Senate seats are up this time. And the House could flip from being barely Republican to barely Democrat, which has basically never happened. That would be unusual, yes.
And California could tip that.
Yeah.
Could really tip
California races could be the people that tip that in either direction.
So
and if people think that that we do not have contested races in California, that is not true. I mean, in this, basically all of the Central Valley congressional districts are absolutely up for grabs. I mean, 110%. So California is where the future happens first.
And I just want to read one headline for you. Yes, your vote matters. Gen Z voters could determine the outcome of the 2024 elections if they turn out.
And to add on to that, in the Central Valley, what we saw in 2020, and we had this forum series, one of our series was brought in all of these Central Valley youth organizers, and we had I think we had the largest youth turnout, and particularly among Latinx youth in the Central Valley. And so, I mean, there's a ton of opportunity to demonstrate the power of that voting bloc. And you know, many of those people are like right here in our student body. And UC Santa Cruz, by the way, is a campus that has the wonderful, you know, title of we are the highest voter turnout campus at the UC. And so if you put that together with the demographic makeup and where our students come from, I mean, like the future starts here, right? So, yeah.
You're going to get that in a few more times.
But vote back home, don't vote here. It doesn't do anything.
Your county, yeah.
Listen.
What are your election predictions and why?
Anyone going to touch that?
No.
About the presidency?
Any election you want to talk about?
Oh, I said it earlier. If the election were held today, he would win. Trump would win. He would win, and I can tell you all why, but we don't have time. But he would win. In my judgment, he would. Today.
If you can do it in
today,
60 seconds, we have enough time.
Well, first of all, you've had 28 states vote on restrictive legislation to vote. Okay, whether it has to do with ID requirements, whether it has to do with a shorter time to vote ahead of time, whether it's fewer ballot boxes, we can go on and on. Okay, that cuts into the turnout. You've got fewer people voting by mail, which of course happened almost everywhere in 2020, which is why we had a huge turnout. You're not going to have that this time. Okay, that's going to hurt Democrats. So, I mean, these are, I think, kind of structural changes that I think in a close race, remember, in a close race, forget California, I'm sorry, I know it's leading everybody forward, but the fact of the matter is it's those 7 states. It's it, kids, it's those 7 states. And the kinds of things we're talking about, along with the changes I mentioned in the electorate earlier, I don't see it for Harris right now. Now, there's time, okay? And in elections like this, quite often, the last weekend, it breaks. And suddenly it's not as close as everybody thought. But I think I hate saying it, you know, I don't sleep at night over this stuff, but as I look at the data right now, she would win, and he would win, and I hope everybody else thinks differently and is right.
And of course, there's lots of local elections and issues, so another reason to come out in California. We do one last question here in person.
How does the rise of third-party support in the political left affect the likelihood of Kamala Harris winning swing states?
So it's similar in a way to the question asked earlier, because there really isn't kind of a major third-party effort. So the example some of you know is that in the election of 2000 in Florida, tens of thousands of people voted for Ralph Nader. A significant percentage of those people, not the highest percentage, would have voted for Al Gore. The election was decided solely based on what happened in Florida. It would have been Al Gore president. So you just have to decide, if you're in a state where your vote matters, are you willing to maybe help accomplish that kind of outcome?
And with that, we're going to have to wrap it up because we're out of time. Thank you all for coming, both online and in person. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to our students, Paulina, Reva, and Luke, for handling the questions. To the audience, make sure you register, make a plan to vote, and are able to do so. It's registertovote.ca.gov. Please join us for the future events in the series. There's 3 more. Next Tuesday, we have an alumni from UC Santa Cruz Carmen Rojas, who's talking about the role of philanthropy. We've heard a little bit about money tonight. This is a case of philanthropy, helping to move money to support community empowerment in our political process. And then October 22nd, engaging digital democracy. And October 30th, decoding the headlines about misinformation in the 2024 presidential campaign. A last round of applause for our panelists, and thank you to all.
As you go out. So grab one, there's information in English and Spanish, take one with you, take some for friends, and then if you want to check your registration, figure out where you should be registered depending on where you live and so on, those are great resources to be able to check that out and get informed.